Dr. Sarah Son. Thank you for joining us in our online session. And then you have 15 minutes for lecture, and then we will have 15 to 20 minutes discussion for our specific topic. Your topic is challenges to the new approaches to North Korean human rights monitoring and advocacy. Okay, floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me today. I'll just share my presentation with you. Okay, so in my presentation today, I'm going to be discussing these 3 points. The first is the impetus for human rights documentation in North Korea and how documentation practices have evolved over the past decade. The second is the political and social challenges to both human rights documentation and advocacy in the North Korean human rights movement. And the final point is around methods used by civil society organizations to try to enliven their North Korean human rights education and outreach work. So first of all, I think for those of us who may be a little bit less familiar with the North Korean human rights movement and its activities, it's worth reminding ourselves of where the momentum for North Korean human rights documentation and advocacy really scaled up and took a step up around a decade ago. So although civil society organizations have been gathering valuable data on the human rights situation in North Korea since the 1990s, it wasn't really until 2013 when a United Nations Commission of Inquiry was formed to formally investigate the issue. The UN COI reported its findings in 2014, garnering more international attention on the human rights problem than really at any time in the past. And as observers of North Korea might well be aware, the UN COI found that crimes against humanity had been committed in North Korea, including this long list of crimes listed here. But the crucial point was that it was determined that these crimes were pursuant to policies at the highest level of the state, thereby kind of assigning responsibility to North Korea for these crimes. As you might also be aware, the United Nations Commission of Inquiry made the recommendation that the situation in North Korea be referred to the International Criminal Court, which is based in The Hague in the Netherlands. In doing so, the UNCOI introduced what we might call the accountability agenda to the North Korean human rights movement. But something it also did was it introduced the concept of transitional justice. And it identified that transitional justice might provide a useful toolkit to begin thinking about how different state and non-state actors should perhaps start planning for a time when North Korea might go through a transition to democracy. And then that might open up then the possibility of redress for decades of human rights violations and authoritarian repression. So initially, in response to all of this, much of the focus around the South Korean and transnational advocacy community on North Korean human rights was then on criminal justice for perpetrators of North Korean human rights violations. And this led to the establishment of a number of activities within civil society and also within the newly opened office in Seoul of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights to begin documenting human rights violations in a more systematic manner, with a view to trying to actually build legal cases from that data. International expertise began to visit South Korea and to engage in collaborative work with civil society organizations. This included experienced international lawyers, prosecutors, people like this, who helped redesign systems and methods of gathering information from witnesses and victims. However, accountability is much broader than just criminal justice. The calls by the UN Commission of Inquiry to consider the mechanisms available within a transitional justice framework also expanded the thinking on non-judicial forms of accountability. Other regions of the world are very rich with examples of how to do transitional justice after mass atrocities or periods of dictatorship. Many of these activities include things like truth-telling activities, reparations regimes, and things like the establishment of museums, memorials, and intergenerational remembering initiatives. Now, these are all designed to ensure that victims' stories are heard and remembered, and the intention is that violence and repression are not forgotten, nor are they ever repeated again. In response to this, civil society organizations in South Korea have complemented their work in the service of future criminal justice proceedings with a range of efforts in the area of non-judicial accountability, some of which I'll touch on in a minute. In South Korea today, I look at how sometimes this happens because of a fear of antagonizing North Korea and bringing violence or diplomatic crises between the two countries. But it's also about how these memories, I think, sometimes unsettle the established, what's called regime of remembrance in South Korea that doesn't quite know how to incorporate the memories of those who've been individually victimized by North Korean state policy. So to understand this phenomenon, I've been exploring the work of North Korean human rights activists through the literature on memory activism, which is a term that comes from the interdisciplinary memory studies field, and it's defined as knowledge-based efforts to deploy a model of change that uses knowledge about a collected past to expand and enrich the dominant collective memory and reframe public debate. Now, the crucial difference between memory activism and other models of social change is this work of looking backwards to reshape how the past is understood in the present with the intention of projecting and amending future resolutions. So memory activism calls for a commemoration of a past that may have been hidden, silenced, or rewritten, revisiting often polarizing pasts for the purpose of reorienting future plans. Now, this sort of memory activism has become more prominent in South Korea in recent years, particularly since the UNCOI resulted in victims and civil society organizations in South Korea becoming aware of the global memory boom that emerged in the years following the Cold War. Since the UNCOI, activists and politicians from other countries have visited Korea to share about their experiences of rebuilding and reconciling after wars, genocides, and dictatorships. Activists have also come from places where violence is still ongoing, and they have exchanged techniques and activism strategies involved in the work of recording and recalling painful memories. Globally, this memory boom has not only challenged traditional beliefs about the objectivity of history, it's also inspired contestation of the hegemonic narratives told by nation states. And yet, as civil society groups and individuals have attempted to mobilize victim memory in the pursuit of activism on North Korean human rights violations, they've met varying degrees of sometimes resistance, sometimes disinterest in South Korea for reasons ranging from declining positivity towards unification as a national ideal to fears of antagonizing the North Korean government. In the time I have left, though, I'd just like to focus in a little more narrowly on the response of the North Korean human rights movement to these challenges, both strategically and practically, to try to navigate around both state and public resistance to their advocacy agenda. So in response to occasional local disinterest and sometimes even opposition towards their memory activism, victims and allies in South Korea have used a wide variety of channels and methods to try to share their memories anyway. A key feature of their strategic adaptation to local aversion has been the transnationalization of memory via engagement with international actors. Transnationalization is a key strategy that's discussed very widely in the memory activism literature, given the extent to which it is an important tool in the toolkit of memory activists who struggle to achieve full acknowledgement at home. Some have described this phenomenon as the creation of something called cosmopolitan memory, and the comfort women issue is one issue in the East Asian context that has experienced recognition in just this way. So the hope in this effort is that transnational engagement that connects victims with communities in other contexts who have similar experiences of injustice or abuse will provide a degree of legitimization for their narratives. It's also hoped that international cooperation, collaboration will boost their skills in using new mediums and new technologies by which to document and apply memory. And the goal is that by doing this, they will gain power, including in the form of things like international funding, to exercise greater agency in their home society and challenge the established regime of remembrance. However, including conducting this advocacy work domestically and internationally, there is another significant challenge faced by activists in the North Korean human rights movement. And this challenge is the lack of effective or affecting data. So what do I mean by this? Well, the reality today is that much activism aimed at the mass national public, both locally and internationally, occurs via social media rather than traditional media or in-person outreach. Increasingly, too, the audience for this information are more attention deficient than ever before. And they will tend only to notice an issue if it is presented in a way that grabs their attention firmly and instantly. So to do this, the information has to compete with all of the other noise in social media feeds. And even sometimes, I've heard reports of younger generations, and I've seen this in my teaching as well, that sometimes they can be a little resistant to bad news or sad stories and may prefer to tune out rather than engage with difficult topics, particularly topics that don't affect them directly. As a result of this, it's imperative that information about human rights in North Korea and calls to act upon this knowledge are delivered in ways that capture attention, generate emotion and curiosity, but that it also provides a sense of hope that the public's involvement can make a difference. However, the current knowledge on North Korean human rights faces three main barriers to achieving these objectives in a social media-driven world. The first is that there is a lack of visual imagery on the situation in North Korea, which is why you have news stories like this one on the left illustrated with a generated image rather than an actual photograph. In recent years in particular, the only imagery really that's been captured of North Korea that isn't presented by the state is satellite imagery, which lacks a human element. It isn't particularly attention-grabbing, even though it can yield insights with expert analysis. The second is that there's rarely anything groundbreaking or new coming out about the nature of human rights violations in North Korea. Even though it is a chronic, long-running and grave problem, there is nothing new to really shock audiences into action. And this is difficult in the current political environment of cross-border and civil wars and leadership crises that tend to drown out the North Korean human rights issue. And finally, the issue lacks celebrity ambassadors that other contexts often achieve. There are no UNICEF ambassadors, for example, traveling to North Korea to make documentaries. Taken together, these factors place pressure on the North Korean human rights movement to innovate in an attempt to enliven human rights, education, and outreach. Fortunately, though, I think we are starting to see the fruits of such endeavors. And before I close, I just wanted to mention a couple of examples and I think they do show promise in terms of enlivening human rights outreach. These are not social media projects, as we might hope, but rather in-person projects. However, both are designed to create visual, highly sensory and memorable encounters with the type of information about human rights in North Korea that is usually really only found in quite dry, difficult to access organizational reports. So on a recent fieldwork trip to Seoul just a few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to experience this kind of innovative form of outreach in the form of an escape room that was made by the Citizens Alliance for North Korean Human Rights with funding from the Ministry of Unification. So I and my colleague had the opportunity to try out this escape room challenge, even though neither of us are very good at puzzles or mathematics. But it took us through a highly realistic, very sensory experience, mimicking the difficult and dangerous journey that North Korean defectors take to travel from North Korea to South Korea. So they told us that over 1,000 South Koreans have tried this experience over the past year as it's traveled from Seoul to Busan, Daegu, and now to Incheon. We conducted an interview with the creators of the escape room after the event, and they told us about how the impact of the escape room is generated by the fact that it creates a more memorable encounter with the learning material than traditional reports. And this is because it gives visitors a highly sensory and emotionally charged experience of the journey from North Korea to South Korea, where the participants have to engage in some of the type of problem solving that North Korean refugees have to deal with in real life. They've had very positive feedback from the participants, which is great to hear, but at the same time, they have reported that they found it quite difficult to engage with schools, for example, where some of the head teachers and the teachers are concerned that the issues involved in the escape room are too contentious to involve students for risk of receiving complaints from parents, which signals that there is still some contestation over these issues in public settings. Now, an additional activity that I encountered during my recent fieldwork was a North Korean human rights museum established by the Database Center for North Korean Human Rights. For this particular exhibition, it was focused on a single theme of freedom of expression. And it was a small exhibition, but it told a compelling story about the limits of freedom of expression in North Korea through recorded defected testimonies, physical artifacts of things people had brought, information people had brought from North Korea. And there was also a little corner displaying artwork by defectors, sharing their sentiments about freedom of expression in abstract ways. There has to date only been limited and often temporary examples of work like this, of exhibitions like this, but I understand that there are plans to try to turn this into something more permanent. Given the short time I have today, I can't share any more, but the final point I wish to end on is that I think it is important that civil society actors, victims, and their allies have the space and the freedom to innovate in both methods of monitoring, documenting, and conducting activism on North Korean human rights issues. There is a great deal of creativity in this under-resourced field, even though it is often constrained by political, economic, and personal limitations. So I'll end now, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. So, very informative and a very systematic analysis on the human rights violation and human rights institution issue in North Korea from, say, other outside, point of view. At the same time, many interesting questions on this issue. I have a few questions. On the first question, why do a majority of South Korean citizens and say Western democracy citizens and less and less interested in North Korean human rights violation and situation? And then you actually suggested a few independent variable, the causes of this very, say, outrageous phenomenon to the human rights activists and the many observers of North Korean dictatorship. I agree. And then South Korea and then others, say, Western democracies, and then they are young people, especially, their life are pretty competitive, especially in South Korea. That actually doesn't allow those young people to think about the other part of Korean Peninsula. It's a dire situation on human rights violation, of course. But at the same time, you suggested those international attention to human rights violation issue in North Korea is dwindling, and then literally competing with other international the news on other human rights violations and other war, other economic crisis, on and on and on. So it might be very difficult for the North Korean human rights violation or human rights situation to get the attention from both international and, say, South Korean domestic media and public opinion. But at the same time, we might need to think about what other say special or distinct features that separates from other human rights violation in other countries. I mean, I think it's we can suggest this in North Korean the human rights violation and human situation. If it has some specific and then outwardly distinction the features, then might get a little bit more attention, and then the easier for us to convince international and South Korean domestic informed public especially to give more attention to North Korean issue.
Yes, absolutely. And I think one of those powerful things that I think civil society organizations in South Korea have been able to do is to show the human face of the North Korean human rights problem. NGOs like Liberty in North Korea in particular have been very successful in generating content, for example, with North Korean refugees, where they are explaining firsthand their own experiences, whether that be through documentaries and films. And I think the caveat to this is accuracy. It's very important that these issues are presented with all of the necessary caveats around representation and, you know, ensuring that they've been thoroughly researched. But yeah, presenting the human side of the North Korean human rights problem, I think for those audiences that have seen it, are very powerful in creating a human connection between us and them, for reminding us that they are human beings just like us.
Well, and then I think it's another interesting aspect is that the dwindling number of North Korean refugees last, I think it's at least a few years or several years. And then do you any say causal relation and correlation between the number of North Korean refugees and the level of interest in a North Korean human rights violation?
I mean, there could be. It's difficult to say, again, because, you know, the numbers, obviously, at the time that the numbers really increased in the kind of mid to late 2000s. Incidentally, at the same time, we had a large number of North Koreans come to the UK in those same years, actually. It's very rare now, but we have one of the largest populations of North Koreans outside South Korea, outside the Korean Peninsula here. And the sheer numbers themselves generated interest and notice. But yeah, there is simply less data. There is simply less up-to-date data. Those who are coming even now from to South Korea, rather, I think have tended often to have left North Korea quite a long time ago, and are actually coming primarily from China rather than from North Korea. So yeah, there is just a lack of new data, and that really is a challenge for civil society organizations who do feel a pressure, I think, towards their funders, towards audiences as well, to share news or information that is new and that is up to date, and that may also be showing impact of their work. Are human rights improving? We don't really know. Or, you know, what sort of information is reaching people and how is that changing their thinking and their behavior? That sort of information with so few people and people who may not have left very recently is much more difficult to come by.
I read your fascinating article from the Political Geography, and then you try to use the GPS data or Google Earth map, to match with those testimony or interview data with North Korean refugees. This is a pretty fascinating, creative way to execute real science or evidence-based research on human rights violation issue in North Korea. What's your experience, and then do you actually innovate this scientific method to research on this issue?
We were working in a team doing this work, and it wasn't my idea. It came from a civil society activist who had been conducting interviews with North Koreans for about 10 years at the time. And he noticed that often, this is Lee Young-won, who's the deputy of the director of the Transitional Justice Working Group. He had noticed that North Koreans who were recalling information about events often would draw what they could remember, and drawing maps of their locale and where they saw things happen was a really interesting way to trigger memory and to also cross-check the accuracy of information with maps of North Korea that some people had brought out. In addition to this, we were noticing that there was more and more open source mapping data of North Korea available, just created by hobbyists, usually people who were just interested, were playing with Google Maps and who were trying to locate particular sites and infrastructure in North Korea and making these maps publicly available. And we found that when you pull this data all together and you bring it into an interview room with a North Korean refugee, it can often be a very interesting and very empowering way for people to be able to tell a story and to have memories triggered that might not be triggered just in an an oral interview alone. So also having visual data to look at together, we found was often quite empowering for the interviewee, because they felt they had some control over that visual, which the interviewer didn't, because they don't know the place, they don't know the buildings, they don't know the sites, whereas the interviewee would be able to kind of provide information about that site, maybe remember things that they would have otherwise forgotten, measure things, make judgments about various aspects of certain incidents that wouldn't have been as possible in a purely oral interview.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Son. It was, fascinating. And then it was very informative. I myself learned a lot, from you on this human rights violation issue. At the same time, how to do research on this issue and how to approach, from the more like, from activism, point of view. And it was pretty informative and very, very valuable to, our project. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.